So, I, there's two themes that come up to me as we're discussing, and I think we're going to be torn between talking about now and talking about the past, and that's
Yeah,
also
that's fine.
part of the nature of your podcast.
Yeah.
But I wanted to zoom in on your point about craft and guild unions, because one of the things I think that you make, uh, the one of the points that you make that is hard for us to see how to deal with today is the implications of decentralizing, deindustrializing, and even franchising the workforce, um, and the way guild unions are able to leverage that. So the carpenters union, the electricians union, etc. For those of you who don't know, guild unions and craft unions are not exactly the same thing, but they're very close. So, um, and when we think of unionized workers today, and we're not thinking about government workers, that those are the people we think about for the most part, unless we like are going back to 50s hard hat nostalgia. Um, there are interesting exceptions, though, and some of them are in a kind of liminal space, such as, the auto workers unions, which is a broad scale industrial union in the past. But some might argue today that actually the shift in auto production means that they may be a little bit closer to a craft union than we'd like to admit, because it is somewhat skilled labor. It is a smallish industry. If you look at the broader movement of the UAW, the UAW's just base of what it can organize is smaller, and it realizes that. I mean, that's part of why it got into things not related to auto production, such as TAs.
Yeah.
But I think I think studying the history of the CAO then does present us with an interesting problem when we're talking about workplaces today. Like the big union struggles of the past 10 years have been Amazon. Okay, so that does kind of look like a factory.
Yeah.
Starbucks, which absolutely does not. And the resurgence of teachers' unions in red states, and nurses' unions and nursing union strikes. Uh, those both interestingly do and don't follow the kind of CAO model. And the part I say where they do is that hospitals, schools, police stations are still fairly centralized workplaces, as opposed to, say, Starbucks, which is, when you're dealing with a Starbucks contract and a local, you might be dealing with 50, 60 workers at a time, as opposed to 500 or 1,000. So I guess the question becomes, what can we learn from the CAO given the difference of conditions?
Yeah. There's a great new book out. I think it was just last year. It was an interview with a historian named John Womack that Peter Olney did, called "Labor, Power, and Strategy," and it's got reflections on that interview from a lot of like leading sort of labor strategists, Bill Fletcher, Jane McAlevey, etc. And it's a really interesting interview. And one of the things that Womack says is that, this phrase power at the point of production, which we tend to associate with the CIO, it's used somewhat, casually today. But what he appreciated about the CIO moment was that it's not just that they were like, okay, like, let's just like, occupy the factories and that'll win us power. It's rather that they saw the connections in the new production processes, and he thinks that's what's important. And he goes back to Wyndham Mortimer's autobiography called "Organize." Mortimer was likely, I think, a member of the Communist Party. He came up through the UMWA. He was sort of a key organizer in the early UAW, and what Womack notices about Mortimer is that he's remarkably sophisticated about thinking through like what were the weaknesses in the points of in the chains of production distribution. And so when the Flint strike was won, for instance, in 1937, they occupied those factories for a long time, and right up until the end they didn't think they were going to win. Right? I mean, it wouldn't have taken much for Governor Murphy to send in the National Guard and just ruin the whole thing. And all of the things that we think about happening in 1937, including, the dramatic growth of the UAW, as well as the organization of the steelworkers, none of that happens it seems, without Flint. And it all was made possible by the fact that they staged this, huge distraction in one plant, and then secretly occupied the motor plant, Chevy plant number 4, because they understood that was the key thing, right? You cannot make cars without motors, and that was the one motor facility in the country. They had studied it, they understood that. It was an understanding of the links in production and distribution that made possible the strategic disruption that they needed at that particular moment. We don't have today fixed capital in these huge factories, right? Like, I mean, you could argue for Amazon, right? But if JFK 8 ever got through that process, right? If for by some miracle they got a contract, what's going to happen? Like, you can move that factory across the street, fire all the workers, and like not have a union anymore. Like, there are
Absolutely.
infinite number of ways in which to break unions today. So the question today is not just flatly applying that model and saying, oh, let's take over the factories and occupy them, right? It's understanding the links, the chains in our deindustrialized logistical economy, and finding new sources of leverage. And I should say again, like, to go back to the craft and guild discussion, you know the AFL should be faulted for what it was, for what it did wrong, and that was a lot, a lot. But what it did right was to understand that that skill offers a point of leverage, and workers should take advantage of all points of leverage, right? Like, we have these romantic ideas about how unions should be organized and how working class people should join together. Well, depending upon your occupation, there's all sorts of different points of leverage that can be sometimes combined, sometimes used on their own, sometimes used in some cases, not others. And I think some variegated understanding of how we organize workers today is much needed, and without just thinking flatly about, oh, we don't have those big factories anymore, and so it's not applicable. Well, they're understanding the links in the chain, and they were saying, if there's any point of leverage, take advantage of it. Take advantage. I should also say, in the CIO moment, it wasn't just disruptive power at the point of production. They were doing all sorts of really innovative things. Like, for instance, the steelworkers are an interesting case, because no one really no one on the left really cares about the steelworkers, because they were not a democratic union. They were top down from the beginning, not the sort of romanticized new left understanding of unions. But the steelworkers, what they did was, one, John L. Lewis and Myron Taylor, the head of US Steel, they sat down for a number of meetings at the Willard Hotel, this fancy hotel, and just sort of hammered out terms, like, between themselves, about as top down as you can get. But they also had a strategy of going in and taking over the company unions. That's not a sexy strategy, like, to go in and try to deal with these obviously compromised institutions. But it worked, right? Like, they found a place where workers were getting together, and they were able to use the company union structure against itself, really. So there was a lot that the CIO did besides just occupy big factories in a dramatic way that led to its success.
Yeah, the company unions are an interesting part of U.S. history. They're very brief, but for those of you who don't know, before the National Labor Relations Act, there was an act that allowed the corporations themselves to set up quasi-unions that were kind of on a, let's say, a corporatist in the old sense of that word model. So, workers working in concert with their owners in a kind of very, very compromised union. And I think it is important to point out that the CAO really did leverage those, try to take those over, get those integrated in. Another thing that makes the CAO interesting, I mean, I bring up, John L. Lewis for a reason, because I think he's one of these people that you can easily make a hero or a villain until you actually study him, and then you realize that, like, oh, this is a very complicated guy who is both very successful, but you're right, comes out of an absolutely autocratic union tradition, the kind of people that Marx and Engels called labor aristocrats. Like, there is a reality to that. But he was willing to work with, like, almost anybody. I mean, the CIO made four was totally willing to work with the TUEL, which for people who don't know, that was an explicitly communist or orientation,
Yeah.
and Lewis was not particularly sympathetic to communists. Like it was, it was not. He just seemed to have an everything in the kitchen sink strategy
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to getting the CIO to have a mass base. I mean, but I was going to ask you. So there's that element of the CIO. There's also its kind of complicated relationship to U.S. labor law, because it doesn't. It seems to me that Lewis being able to really break with the AFL um, and form the CIO is tied to the conditions that lead also up to the National Labor Relations Act. So, and what is the kind of relationship do you see between the CIO and changing labor law in the 1930s?
Yeah, I mean, just real quickly about Lewis. I mean, he was an asshole start to finish. There's like no two ways about it. Like even when he was the champion of labor, he was being awful, awful behind the scenes. And he was actually like quite, I mean, I think that when we think of like good union leaders, we think of I don't know. I mean, someone like Harry Bridges or someone. I mean, someone
Mm-hmm.
who understood, understood what it was to be a union leader, but like still felt himself part of the rank and file, like that kind of thing, right? Lewis was not that at all. Lewis thought of himself as a kind of aristocrat. Like he didn't interact with other labor leaders. You could argue that he didn't like being a part of the labor movement. I mean, he really isolated himself in a lot of ways. And so he was, I mean, from one angle, about as bad as a labor leader can be. And I think that we just have to like live with that contradiction that like, despite that fact, he was still able to see an opportunity at the right moment. So I think it's a sort of model lesson in not overly vilifying certain people, because you never know like when someone's going to see a particular opportunity. And Melvin Dubofsky, who's written along with Warren Van Tyne the definitive biography of Lewis, he said from start to finish, Lewis was interested in power. In the 1920s, he did about as good as he could, right, in a dying industry, with new welfare capitalism that was sort of like cutting into like union gains. Like it was, it was a failure, but you don't necessarily need to blame him given the conditions. And then in the 1930s, he saw a completely new situation and he took advantage of it, because he was interested in his own power. So, it's good to see these things as contradictory and mixed rather than romanticized. I think you're right about that. The relation between uh, labor policy, labor law, and the moment. I mean, I think it's best to see those two things, in a sort of dialectical progression, right? It wasn't just that one made possible the other, but that there was a kind of interplay, that there was a figuring out of what kind of thing would work for the present moment, given what was going on in, disruption and organizing and whatnot. And so, some people, if you read Elizabeth Cohen's Making a New Deal, or Robert Zieger's The CIO, which is really the sort of like key text about the CIO. You read them, and a lot of importance is accorded to the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? This, what was ultimately a flawed corporatist attempt to rein in big business practices, right? Had this one section 7A, that said, oh, we recognize the right of workers to form unions of their own choosing. It wasn't, it didn't really have teeth. It wasn't enforced in such a way that like actually gave most workers unions. But it was an inspiration. And again, Lewis, Sidney Hillman, and David Dubinsky and the garment workers unions, they all said, look, this is an opportunity. We can go out and say, for the first time in a while, seemingly, the government is saying, go for it. Yeah, now's the time. And they took advantage of that, I think, quite well. And so from one angle, you could say, oh, somewhat unintentionally, this policy made possible new union organizing. Well, some people also say that the what was going on in the early 30s, sort of like unemployment marches, lots of other sort of forms of disruption, the sort of nascent beginnings of the sit-down strike. It was that disruption, and of course the radial crisis of the Great Depression, that spurred Roosevelt to add Section 7A to the Recovery Act. And so, from one angle, it's the organizing and disruption that led to it. From another angle, it's the policy that made possible new organizing. And I think it's both really. It was a dynamic situation. It was a fluid situation. So the Wagner Act, which really, sanctified collective bargaining, it's still with us today, albeit in, dramatically reduced and constraining form. That was passed in 1935. And almost right away, the big companies said, we're not going to obey this. This is ridiculous. This is unconstitutional. We don't have to, go through this sort of government-led process of recognizing unions. We're not going to recognize them. They also started a whole bunch of new company unions as well. They're like, we can contain this. It's not a big deal. And so it wasn't really until after the Flint strike and 37 that the Supreme Court finally declares the Wagner Act constitutional. Why was that? Jeremy Brecker, a labor historian who's I interview on the podcast, he says you'd have to get into the minds of the justices to understand why they finally declared the Wagner Act constitutional and very shortly thereafter declared the sit-down strike unconstitutional. But it's really difficult to see this broad scale change in the justice's opinion without looking to what was going on in the country. After Flint, the sit-down strike spread everywhere. Like, the disruptiveness was everywhere. And so they looked at the Wagner Act and they said, this is a chance to stabilize things. This is a chance to channel this disruption into stable collective bargaining and stop all this industrial strife. So, I think it's dynamic. I think that the organizing led to the policy, and the policy impacted the organizing. And it really wasn't until the war, I would say, that things leveled out, with the War Labor Board and, the CIOs buying into the war efforts and willingness to, sign no strike pledges and all this stuff. It wasn't really until then that things really evened out. And that dialectic, that sort of dynamic situation between law and organizing, that sort of stopped and settled into, what we know as the post-war compromise.